He watched them cut out her tongue in the public square, a brutal sentence for speaking truth to power. But Jeremy Hansen, a simple human mechanic, couldn't just walk away. He dragged her bleeding body into the shadows. Knowing sheltering a Valkyrie fugitive meant signing his own death warrant, what he discovered in his workshop would unravel a conspiracy that threatened thousands of human lives. The metallic tang of blood already hung thick in Divac District's recycled air, that familiar scent of copper and ozone that clung to every Valkyrie enforcement action. Jeremy Hansen moved through the crowded market corridors, grease staining his coveralls, a data pad weighing down his pocket. He kept his head down. Just another human mechanic in Valkyrie territory trying to finish his shift and collect his credits. The crowd pressed close around food stalls selling spiced grubs and synthesized protein, the constant hum of bartering and footsteps filling the narrow space between prefab structures. Then the sharp clatter of armored boots cut through the market noise. 2 Valkyrie enforcers dragged a woman through the parting crowd, their ceremonial blades catching the harsh station lighting. Her 4-fingered hands were bound behind her back, the subtle bioluminescent patterns along her arms flickering with distress. The crowd fell silent instantly, the way they always did when Valkyrie justice came to the public square. No one wanted to be noticed when the enforcers made an example. The lead enforcer's voice echoed across the suddenly quiet space. This one spreads lies against the state. She corrupts the truth with forbidden knowledge. Jeremy froze where he stood, his mechanic's instincts screaming at him to look away, to disappear into the crowd. But his feet stayed rooted as he watched the brutal efficiency of the sentence. A flash of steel, a spray of crimson against the polished floor plates. The woman collapsed without a sound, her body hitting the ground with a terrible finality. Her eyes found his across the square, wide, alien pupils contracting in pain, yet holding a clarity that punched through the horror. That silent plea in the widening pool of her own blood undid years of carefully constructed neutrality. Valkyrie justice meant to teach every spectator that truth belonged only to power, that defiance earned only suffering. But something in her defiance, the unbroken will in those strange eyes, cracked Jeremy's practiced indifference wide open. He moved without thinking, his body acting on pure instinct honed from years of crawling through maintenance ducts and narrow access ways. While the guards scanned the crowd for any reaction, Jeremy was already slipping through the periphery, his hands slipping under her shoulders, dragging her weight into the shadows between 2 market stalls. His life divided into before and after. In that single moment, the mechanic who followed orders became the man hiding a fugitive in the station's underbelly. The stench of copper followed them into the maintenance ducts, his heart hammering against his ribs loud enough he thought the enforcers might hear it through the bulkheads. Her blood soaked through his coveralls, warm and startlingly blue against the faded fabric. He half carried, half dragged her through the narrow passageways, his muscles straining with the effort. Each breath coming in sharp gasps that echoed in the confined space. Somewhere above them, the market would be returning to normal, vendors resuming their calls, customers pretending they hadn't witnessed another Valkyrie lesson. But down here in the service tunnels, Jeremy's world had narrowed to the weight of a dying stranger and the certain knowledge that his own life was now forfeit. His boots slipped on the grating, the only sound besides their ragged breathing and the distant hum of the station's life support systems. His workshop smelled of ozone and fear, that particular blend of burnt circuitry and cold sweat that clung to the air whenever a job went wrong. Only this time the job was a bleeding Valkyrie woman laid out on his grease-stained workbench. Jeremy cleared away diagnostic tools and scattered components with a sweep of his arm, the metallic clatter unnaturally loud in the cramped space. Her blood seeped into the printed circuit diagrams taped to the bench surface, the blue fluid spreading through the copper traces and silicon pathways, like some terrible liquid circuit board. He pressed a clean rag against the wound at her mouth, watching the fabric darken almost instantly. The bootsteps started then, sharp, rhythmic impacts against the corridor plating outside. Valkyrie patrols sweeping the sector, their movements precise and methodical. The thin bulkheads of his workshop offered no real protection, just the illusion of privacy. He could hear the distinct clicking of their weapon harnesses, the low hum of their comm units. Human authorities would exile him for sheltering a political fugitive, strip his credentials and dump him on some rock with minimal oxygen and maximum regret. The Valkyrie would simply execute them both in the same public square where they'd cut her tongue out. No trials, no appeals, just another lesson for anyone watching. Her breathing grew shallow, the rise and fall of her chest becoming erratic. Jeremy's hands trembled as he rummaged through the stolen tech crates stacked against the back wall. His fingers brushed against power converters, plasma cutters, sensor arrays, all useless for keeping someone alive. Then he remembered the experimental neural link, the black market tech from that Terran shipment he'd diverted months ago. It was supposed to interface with ship systems, bypass damaged control panels when repairs weren't an option. He'd tucked it away thinking he might retrofit it for engine diagnostics. The device felt cold and heavy in his hands, a matte black box with a series of fine probes designed to connect with machine interfaces, not biology. He wiped the blood from her temple with a clean section of the rag, his touch surprisingly gentle considering how his heart hammered against his ribs. The neural link hummed to life when he activated it, the sound a low vibration that seemed to sync with the panicked rhythm of his own pulse. The probes glowed with a soft blue light that mirrored the strange patterns on her skin. He made the choice without hesitation. Mercy over survival, compassion over self-preservation. The neural link would bypass her ruined speech center, create a direct pathway from her thoughts to a voice synthesizer. It was an insane gamble using Terran tech on Valkyrie neurobiology, but watching her bleed out on his workbench felt like a worse option. Her eyes tracked his movements, those alien pupils focusing with sharp calculating intelligence that seemed utterly at odds with her broken body. There was no fear in that gaze, only intense observation and something that looked like curiosity. He muttered the words more to himself than to her, his voice rough with tension. "Stay alive. I'll get your voice back." As if in response, the patrol klaxons began blaring in the distance, the warning sirens cutting through the constant hum of station life support. The sound echoed through the ventilation shafts, growing louder by the second. They were locking down the sector, methodically searching compartment by compartment. He adjusted the neural link against her temple, the device's lights flickering as it sought connection with her unfamiliar brain chemistry. Outside, the bootsteps grew closer, more purposeful now. They'd reach his workshop door in minutes, maybe less. The neural link sparked against her temple, a tiny arc of blue electricity that made both of them flinch. Jeremy adjusted the voice synthesizer's settings with fingers that felt thick and clumsy, his knuckles white from gripping the calibration tool too hard. This was a rough Terran model, slapped together in some back alley workshop on Mars, designed for mining rig diagnostics and industrial automation. It had never been tested on Valkyrie physiology, never even considered for a biological interface. The manual, if it had one, probably contained warnings about permanent neural scarring and cognitive degradation. He ignored the hypothetical risks and twisted the frequency dial another quarter turn. Her body convulsed violently, a full-body shudder that nearly threw her off the workbench. Alien neurotransmitters rejected the human tech, her system treating the neural connection like a poison or a parasite. The monitor above the bench flashed crimson, her vital signs spiking into dangerous territory. Heart rate skyrocketed, brain activity showing chaotic, frantic patterns that looked more like a seizure than communication. For a terrifying second, Jeremy thought he'd killed her, that his attempt to save her had instead finished what the Valkyrie blade started. The air in the workshop felt thin, his own breathing shallow as he watched the lines on the screen dance toward catastrophic failure. Static crackled from the speaker, a harsh, grating noise that shredded the tense silence. Then a broken digital syllable emerged, distorted and slow. Contaminated. The word hung in the ozone-thick air, incomplete but horrifyingly clear. Jeremy's head snapped up from the monitor. He adjusted the frequencies again, his movements quicker now, more certain. He turned a dampening knob, lowered the input sensitivity, his eyes never leaving her face. Her skin was cooler than human, a fact he registered as her hand shot out and gripped his wrist. The strength in her fingers surprised him, the subtle bioluminescent marks along her forearm pulsing with a soft, rhythmic light that seemed to sync with the now steadying beep of the heart monitor. The synthesizer stabilized abruptly, the static clearing into a haunting mechanical voice that was neither human nor Valkyrie. It was a thing of filtered tones and artificial cadence, but the words were unmistakable. The shipments, medical supplies, poison. Jeremy froze, the calibration tool slipping from his fingers to clatter against the floor plating. The truth she had tried to expose, the forbidden knowledge that cost her her tongue, laid bare in 6 synthesized words. The shocking reality of it unfolded in his mind with terrible clarity. She revealed that Terran colonies were receiving medical shipments specifically designed to cause slow, untraceable neurological death. Not faulty supplies, not accidental contamination. Purposeful, engineered poison disguised as humanitarian aid. His eyes dropped to the shipping manifests scattered across his workbench, the very ones he'd been sorting before he left for the market. He saw the codes he'd logged, the routes he'd confirmed. He'd installed the environmental control systems on those cargo haulers himself, ensuring the temperature-sensitive medical supplies would remain stable during transit. He'd personally verified the integrity seals on containers marked with the Red Crescent and Red Cross symbols. He'd been proud of that work, believing he was helping get crucial antibiotics and vaccines to frontier settlements that desperately needed them. The hypocrisy of it turned his stomach. His tools weren't just on the floor. His entire understanding of his place in this system, his complicity in it, lay shattered beside them. He was not just a mechanic who had saved a woman. He was a man who had helped deliver the very instrument of her people's genocide. Nari's synthetic voice grew stronger, losing its earlier static as the neural link stabilized its connection to her consciousness. She reached for Jeremy's terminal with a four-fingered hand that moved with surprising precision, despite the trauma her body had endured. Her fingers flew across the interface, bypassing security protocols with codes that shouldn't exist outside Valkyrie intelligence circles. She accessed hidden data nodes buried deep in the station's network, her movement swift and certain. Valkyrie encryption melted under her commands like ice under a plasma torch, layer after layer of digital security dissolving before her relentless access patterns. The terminal screen flickered with streams of data too rapid for Jeremy to follow. Symbols and schematics flashing too quickly for human eyes to register. Red security alerts flashed across the secondary monitor almost immediately. Dravik's regime had trackers embedded in their most sensitive files, digital tripwires designed to alert enforcers the moment anyone touched forbidden information. The alerts pulsed with increasing urgency, each flash marking their position more precisely within the station's network architecture. Jeremy watched the countermeasures activating in real time, security bots rerouting to their sector, communication channels being monitored, access points sealing throughout their level. They were painting a target on his workshop with every second she spent in the system, but Nari didn't slow her work. Her focus remained absolute, her bioluminescent markings glowing brighter with concentration. She projected schematics onto the main display, rotating three-dimensional models of antibiotic vials that looked perfectly normal to the naked eye. Then she zoomed in, down to the molecular level, revealing the nanoparasites hidden within the medical solutions. They were elegant, terrible things, sleek synthetic organisms designed to mimic human cells until they reached neural tissue. The design was insidious in its simplicity, using the body's own delivery systems against itself. The parasites would travel through the bloodstream disguised as nutrients, bypassing immune responses because they didn't register as foreign material. They only activated when they reached the blood-brain barrier, their programming shifting from camouflage to destruction. The contamination wasn't designed for quick death. The parasites mimicked natural neurological decay, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, conditions that would appear to be tragic but natural outcomes of frontier living. They'd be undetectable until thousands were already dead, the patterns of illness written off as statistical anomalies or the price of colonization. There would be no sudden epidemics to investigate, just a gradual, heartbreaking decline across multiple settlements. Medical teams would focus on treatment and palliative care, never suspecting the antibiotics they administered were actually delivering the very agents causing the neurological damage. The perfect crime against humanity, disguised as humanitarian aid. Jeremy scanned the delivery manifests on his datapad, his stomach tightening as he cross-referenced the shipment codes Nari had highlighted. He'd routed 3 of those contaminated shipments to Helios human sectors just last week. He remembered the paperwork, the approvals, the routine nature of the transaction. He'd even joked with the loading crew about getting bonus credits for the expedited delivery. The memory turned sour in his mouth, the casual compliance of his actions now weighing like stones in his gut. Those medical supplies were likely already being distributed, already working their silent destruction in innocent people. Nari brought up profit projections on another screen, showing how Dravik's conglomerate stood to gain from the manufactured plagues. As human colonies failed, Their territories would become available for Valkyrie expansion at bargain prices. Their infrastructure would be inherited, their resources absorbed, their populations conveniently diminished through natural causes. The economic projections showed staggering returns on investment, with timelines measured in years rather than decades. This wasn't just ethnic cleansing, it was corporate takeover disguised as tragedy, genocide as business strategy. The mechanic became conspirator in that moment, his perspective shifting from horrified observer to active participant. His hands shook not from fear anymore, but from pure, undiluted rage. The grease under his fingernails, the tool calluses on his palms, these markers of his honest work felt like accusations now. He had facilitated this atrocity with his own hands, his technical skills used to deliver death wrapped in hope. They now shared two secrets in the humming silence of the workshop: the genocide unfolding across human settlements, and the fact that its key witness was bleeding on his workbench. The neural link glowed softly at Nari's temple, its connection to the terminal maintaining their access to the truth, even as security teams closed in. Outside, the bootsteps were getting louder, more purposeful. They were running out of time, but they now possessed the evidence that could break Dravik's regime, if they could stay alive long enough to use it. "We need human security," Jeremy said, the words tasting strange in his mouth. Trusting any form of authority felt like a gamble, but the evidence they carried was too heavy for just the two of them. He pulled a heavy hooded maintenance jacket over Nari's shoulders, his fingers careful as he adjusted the fabric to conceal her distinctive Valkyrie cranial ridges. The hood cast a deep shadow over her face, hiding the neural link at her temple and the terrible wound beneath it. She stood still, allowing the adjustment, her alien eyes watching him with that unnerving calm. She moved her jaw slightly, a silent acknowledgement, the gesture oddly human despite her physiology. Station-wide alert sirens began their low, pulsing wail. Every public screen in the corridor outside his workshop flickered to life, overriding normal programming. Her image filled the displays, captured from some official Valkyrie database. She looked severe and imposing, her bioluminescent markings clearly visible, her gaze direct and challenging. Bold red text scrolled underneath. "Dangerous fugitive, armed and psychotic, approach with extreme caution." The description was a calculated lie, designed to make people see a monster instead of a victim. It made Jeremy's hands clench. They hadn't even listed her name, just reduced her to a threat to be eliminated. The alert repeated every 30 seconds, a constant reminder that every camera and every citizen was now a potential enemy. Jeremy used his maintenance codes on the service door panel, his palm slick with sweat on the biometric scanner. The light flickered from red to green with a soft chime, and the door hissed open into a narrower, dimly lit corridor used only by station engineers. The air was cooler here, smelling of lubricant and filtered oxygen. They moved quickly, Nari's movements surprisingly graceful and silent for someone who had nearly bled out on his workbench hours before. She had a predator's economy of motion, each step precise and balanced, her four-fingered hand occasionally brushing the wall for support. She wasn't just enduring the pain, she was managing it, compartmentalizing it with a discipline he'd only seen in special ops soldiers. It was another piece of her story, another question he didn't have time to ask. He activated his personal comm, routing the signal through a scrambled channel he used for bypassing comms blackouts during critical repairs. The line hissed with static for a long moment before a voice answered, crisp and all business. "Hold." Jeremy kept his voice low, barely above a whisper. "Commander, I have a situation. And evidence. Valkyrie-level evidence." He didn't give details, just a data packet containing a sliver of what Nari had uncovered, the nanoparasite schematics, a fragment of the profit projections. The line went silent for a full minute, the only sound their breathing and the distant hum of the station. Holt's voice returned, tighter now, stripped of its official neutrality. "I've been tracking anomalous death rates in the Helios Beta sector. Early-onset neural degradation. My medics thought it was environmental. Your evidence confirms it's not." The commander's tone hardened, shifting from curiosity to grim resolve. "Dravik won't let this witness live. He'll burn the whole sector to ash to bury this. Where are you now?" Jeremy relayed their position, a junction of maintenance conduits 3 levels below the public thoroughfares. "Stay there. I'm sending a team. Do not move." The channel clicked off. In the sudden silence of the conduit, the reality of their new alliance settled over them. They were now tied to a human commander willing to defy both Valkyrie power and his own probably compromised chain of command. Nari turned to him. The station alert continued its silent flash on a small display panel nearby, her own face staring back at her as a branded criminal. She placed her four-fingered hand over his where it rested against the cold metal wall. Her skin was still cooler than his, the touch a deliberate, calming pressure. The neural link at her temple emitted a soft pulse of light. The voice synthesizer whispered, its mechanical tone somehow softer now. Perhaps we can teach each other. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of their impossible partnership, human mechanic and Valkyrie whistleblower. He looked from their joined hands to her shadowed eyes, seeing the intelligence and the pain there. He answered, the word simple and true. I'd like that. The ventilation grate above them exploded inward in a shower of metal shards. 3 red laser dots appeared, one on his chest, one on Nari's forehead, one dancing between them. The air filled with the high-pitched whine of charging energy weapons. They were out of time. Holt's safe house smelled of sterilizer and suspicion, the sharp scent of antiseptic barely covering the underlying tension in the room. The place felt temporary and sterile, a way station for secrets rather than a home. Jeremy watched Lieutenant Howell's fingers fly across the holographic interfaces, pulling data streams from Nari's neural link with a focused intensity. Light from the displays reflected in Howell's glasses, making her eyes unreadable. She worked with the grim efficiency of someone who'd handled too many emergencies, her movements crisp and devoid of wasted motion. Data scrolled down the main screen. Genetic sequences, chemical formulations, delivery matrices. The evidence of Dravik's genocide unfolded in lines of code and biological schematics, each file a damning piece of the puzzle. Outside, the silence felt wrong. The safe house occupied a supposedly secure block in a neutral sector, but the normal sounds of station life were absent. No distant hum of maglev transports, no murmur of passing conversations from the corridor. Jeremy moved to the reinforced viewport, keeping to the edge to avoid being seen. He didn't need to see much. The telltale gleam of polished Valkyrie armor reflected in the light from a docking bay across the street. Dravik's personal guard, their distinctive crimson insignia visible even at a distance, had formed a perimeter around the entire block. They weren't trying to hide their presence. This was a siege, not a covert operation. They were waiting for something or someone. The tactical display on Howell's console lit up with proximity alerts, red circles tightening around their location. They were surrounded, cut off from any exit Holt might have planned. Howell didn't look up from her work, her voice flat. They're here for the data, and the source. She isolated a particular genetic marker on her screen, cross-referencing it against medical databases. The system pinged a match. The nanoparasites shared a rare biosignature with a Valkyrie immunosuppressant, a pharmaceutical compound banned in Terran space for its neurological side effects. It was the smoking gun, the deliberate design flaw that linked the poison directly to Dravik's bioweapons division. The complexity of the engineering was its own confession. This wasn't an accident or a contamination. It was a weapon, designed to use medicine as its delivery system, to turn healing into a slow, untraceable murder. The medical scanner on the table beside Nari beeped, its routine sweep completing. Howell glanced at it, her professional focus shifting for a second. Her eyebrows drew together. She tapped the screen, reset the parameters, and ran the scan again. The device beeped a second time, the same result flashing. She turned the display toward Jeremy, her expression unreadable. The readout showed a biological image, a familiar shape, but the genetic markers scrolling beside it were impossible. Human and Valkyrie DNA intertwined, helix patterns braided together in a way that defied every known law of xenobiology. The two species were incompatible at a chromosomal level, their biological frameworks too divergent for even basic cellular integration. Science said this couldn't happen. The scanner said it was happening. Pregnancy. The word hung in the air, heavier than any weapon threat. The timeline was impossible, the biology was impossible. Jeremy stared at the screen, his mind racing through the events of the last few days, the hours in his workshop, the frantic escape. His eyes shifted from the impossible genetic readout to Nari, who was watching him calmly from the medbay cot. Her hand rested lightly on her abdomen, a gesture that now made a terrifying, wonderful kind of sense. How? The word left his lips, stripped of everything but pure, stunned confusion. It was a question for the universe, for biology, for the sheer improbability of their situation. Nari's bioluminescent markings pulsed softly. The neural link at her temple glowed, and her synthetic voice emerged. But the usual mechanical flatness was gone, replaced by a softer, almost gentle modulation. Your mercy broke more than one barrier. It wasn't a scientific explanation. It was something else entirely. The acknowledgement of connection that went beyond pheromones or genetics, a bond formed in a shared moment of extreme vulnerability and compassion. In saving her life and choosing to see her as a person worth saving despite the cost, he had apparently triggered a biological response that textbooks claimed was a fantasy. Their child was a medical miracle and a political bomb, a living challenge to the very ideology of separation that Dravik's genocide was built upon. The main door to the safe house exploded inward. The shockwave hit them first, a physical force that threw Howell back from her console. Then came the sound, a deafening roar of splintering metal and fracturing reinforcement beams. Shrapnel peppered the room, ricocheting off equipment and embedding itself in the walls. Smoke and the acrid smell of explosives flooded the space, choking and thick. Their sanctuary was gone, replaced by a cloud of debris and the shouted commands of Valkyrie extremists pouring tea. Dr. Sims pointed at the neural link's readout, the screen displaying a cascade of red warnings that pulsed in time with the low, urgent beeping of the fetal monitor. The lines charting the baby's neural activity spiked erratically, a chaotic dance of distress translated into light and sound. The electromagnetic field generated by the Terran device, perfectly safe for interfacing with ship systems, was playing hell with the unique hybrid biology developing inside Nari. The EM interference is stressing the fetus, Sims said, her voice stripped of any medical neutrality, leaving only hard fact. Its developing neural architecture can't stabilize. The patterns are all wrong. It has to come off now. She looked from the screen to Jeremy, her gaze leaving no room for argument. The choice was a brutal, simple equation with no good variables. Remove the neural link and Nari lost her voice. The device was the only thing bridging the gap the Valkyrie blades had carved. The only thing translating her thoughts into words anyone could hear. She would return to that terrible, isolated silence, unable to communicate the truth that could save thousands, unable to even cry out in pain. Keep the device active and the child died. The interference would continue to scramble the baby's developing brain, causing catastrophic, irreversible damage. It was a perverse inversion of the initial choice Jeremy had made in his workshop. Then it had been mercy over survival. Now it was one life over another, a voice against a future. The hum of medical equipment filled the tense silence, each beep a ticking clock counting down to a devastating outcome. The resolution was as heartbreaking as it was inevitable. There was no technology, no clever trick to circumvent the fundamental conflict. The Terran tech and the Valkyrie human biology were fundamentally incompatible in this specific, cruel way. The only way to save both was to sacrifice the link and find another way to restore Nari's voice. A solution that did not yet exist. Jeremy made the choice without looking away from Nari's face. Our child comes first. The words were quiet, final. It wasn't a rejection of her. It was a commitment to the impossible life they had created together. He was choosing their future, even if it meant severing their primary connection to the present. Nari nodded, a single sharp dip of her chin. Her hand found the edge of the medbay table, her four-fingered grip turning her knuckles pale. She closed her eyes, her bioluminescent markings dimming slightly as she braced herself. Dr. Sims moved quickly, her fingers deft on the neural link's control panel. She entered the shutdown sequence. The soft blue glow at Nari's temple flickered, faded, and then died. The gentle hum that had been a constant presence since the workshop ceased abruptly. Sims carefully detached the probes from Nari's skin, placing the now inert device on a tray with a soft metallic clink. Silence returned. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, thicker and more profound than before. The only sounds were the medical monitors and the harsh rhythm of their breathing. Nari's eyes opened. They were wide, filled with a storm of frustration, fear, and loss that her face could no longer express. Her jaw worked, muscles tensing as she tried to form a sound, any sound, but nothing came out. Her eyes screamed what her mouth could not. the sheer force of her unvoiced thoughts almost a physical pressure in the room. Jeremy reached for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers, a silent promise in the grip. The door to the medbay slid open. A Valkyrie woman stood there, her stance tense, her eyes scanning the room with a medic's quick assessment. She wore the insignia of a biological science specialist, but her uniform was smudged with grease and her posture was that of someone who had been running. This was Specialist Terran. She had defied lockdown orders, bypassed security checkpoints, and come alone. Her gaze fell on Nari, on the raw wound the neural link had concealed, and her own features tightened with a mix of professional interest and personal anger. She didn't bother with greetings or explanations. She pulled a sealed canister from her med pack, the contents a shimmering opalescent gel that seemed to hold its own light. "Our science can regrow her tongue," Terran said, her voice low and precise. "The process is slow, painful. It requires daily applications and constant cellular monitoring, but it will be her own tissue. Organic. No more interference." She looked at Jeremy, then back to Nari. "This biogel is a prototype, suppressed by Dravik's regime," he deemed it. Too compassionate. She applied the first layer of gel with a delicate tool, the substance lung Q against the damaged tissue. Nari flinched, a full-body shudder at the contact, her grip on Jeremy's hand tightening to the point of pain. Then as the biogel began its work, stimulating nerve endings and triggering cellular regeneration, a sound escaped her. It wasn't from a synthesizer. It wasn't a word. It was a ragged, painful, entirely organic breath, scraping through a throat that hadn't made its own sound in days. It was raw and awful and beautiful. It was a beginning. The council chamber echoed with tension, a vast circular space where every whisper seemed to amplify against the polished metallic walls. Representatives from both human and Valkyrie factions filled the tiered seating, their postures rigid, their faces carefully neutral. The air hummed with the low thrum of climate control and unspoken hostility. At the center of it all, Nari stood before High Counselor Dravik's raised podium. A temporary vocal implant was affixed to her throat, a sleek silver device that emitted a soft, constant hum. It was a stopgap measure, a crude speaker compared to the neural link, but it gave her a voice for what needed to be said today. Her bioluminescent markings were subdued, her hands clasped calmly in front of her. She looked diminished next to Dravik's imposing presence, a calculated effect of the setting. Dravik smirked down at her from his elevated position, his fingers steepled on the polished surface before him. He expected a broken creature, a victim whose spirit had been carved out along with her tongue. He saw the medical device on her throat, the slight pallor of her skin, the way she favored one side where her injuries were still healing. This was the picture he had orchestrated, a subdued, broken thing he could dismiss as a traumatized liar. His confidence was a tangible force in the room, the smug assurance of a man who believed he had already won, that this tribunal was merely a formality before her execution, and the silencing of her story for good. He gestured for her to speak, a lazy, dismissive wave of his hand that was an insult in itself. Nari did not speak. Instead, her fingers moved on a small control pad in her palm. The main display screen behind Dravik, which had been showing his official insignia, flickered and changed. The audio that filled the chamber was unmistakably his own voice, crisp and clear, devoid of the implant's artificial tone. It was a private recording, pulled from a secure server Howell had helped her access. The parasites were perfect. Dravik's recorded voice was calm, pleased, slow acting, difficult to detect. By the time their primitive medical science even considers it anything but natural decay, the demographic adjustments will be irreversible. The profit margins alone are worth the initial investment, but the territorial gains— The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that hissed through the chamber. Heads turned from the screen to the man on the podium. Dravik's face paled, the smirk dissolving into a look of stunned disbelief. He hadn't just been recorded. He'd been recorded admiring his own handiwork. He snapped. The calculated composure shattered. He lunged forward, gripping the edges of his podium, his face contorted with rage. "You think this changes anything?" he shouted, his voice ringing through the silent room, now addressing everyone and no one. "So what if a few thousand humans die a little early? Their colonies are inefficient, their expansion a blight. By the time your primitive doctors realized what was happening, the problem would have solved itself. They would be dead and we would own their resources." It was clean. It was efficient. He was not denying it. He was justifying it, defending the architecture of the genocide as if it were a sensible business plan. He was so enraged at being exposed, so confident in his own power, that he didn't realize he was confessing to every single charge. Admiral Kwan, the senior human official on the council, rose slowly from his seat. His face was granite. "Counselor Dravik," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent chamber. "Do I understand you correctly? You confess to the deliberate contamination of medical supplies? You confess to orchestrating a genocide for personal profit and territorial gain?" The questions hung in the air, formal and deadly. There was no going back from this. The truth was no longer in a data file or a whispered accusation. It was in the room, shouted from the lips of the perpetrator himself. The response was immediate and visceral. Human guards stationed around the chamber tightened their grips on their rifles. But more tellingly, the Valkyrie honor guards, Dravik's own people, also shifted their stance. Their weapons, which had been held at a neutral-ready position, now swung toward the podium. They aimed not at Nari, but at the High Counselor they were sworn to protect. Their loyalty was to the state, to the law, not to a man who would poison children and grandparents for a credit profit. The metallic click of safeties being disengaged echoed sharply. Nari's temporary Impladravik's loyalists hit the apartment door with plasma cutters. The high-pitched whine of the tools biting into reinforced metal, deafening in the confined space. The air filled with the acrid smell of superheated steel and ozone. Holt shoved Jeremy behind a heavy reinforced table they'd upended. His voice a sharp command cut through the noise. "They're not here for us. They want the evidence deleted. The data dies with her." He gestured toward the main console where Howell was frantically working, and to Nari, who was breathing through a powerful contraction, her face pale and beaded with sweat. The extremists weren't attempting a breach to capture or negotiate. This was a scorched earth operation. Silence the witness, destroy the proof, and let the official story say they died in a tragic, violent shootout with authorities. The door groaned, a section of it glowing orange and sagging inward. Nari's body was racked with another labor pain, a deep internal pressure that made her gasp and clutch her abdomen. But as a Valkyrie guard's body, felled by a Jingjun shot from Holt, slumped to the floor just inside the breach, her focus shifted. Her eyes, sharp with pain a second before, locked onto the pistol holstered at the dead man's hip. She moved. It wasn't the awkward, pained movement of a woman in advanced labor. It was a fluid, predatory roll that brought her next to the body, her four-fingered hand closing around the weapon's grip with practiced ease. She came up in a crouch, the pistol held in a stable, two-handed grip that spoke of extensive training. Valkyrie combat instincts completely overrode human physical weakness. Pain became data to be processed, not a barrier to action. The extremist attack was a calculated, desperate move to obliterate the truth, with Dravik's public confession still echoing across every screen on the station. His loyalists knew the only way to potentially salvage his power, or at least create enough chaos and doubt to escape punishment, was to make the evidence disappear. If Nari and the data drives were destroyed, Dravik could claim his confession was extracted under duress, part of a human conspiracy. The attack was a brutal, direct assault on the truth itself, an attempt to murder fact and replace it with plausible deniability and the fog of violence. They were terrifyingly outnumbered and outgunned, facing fanatics with nothing left to lose. Howell didn't look up from her console, even as bullets sparked and ricocheted off the metal housing around her. Her fingers were a blur, rerouting the broadcast feeds through emergency channels and low-level maintenance bandwidths that the Valkyrie jamming had overlooked. She was the shield for the data, her work ensuring that even if they died in this room, the truth was already replicating across backup servers and public alert systems. "I've got it patched into environmental controls and public address," she shouted over the gunfire, her voice steady despite the rounds pinging near her head. "They can't kill this signal now. It's in the ventilation shafts." Jeremy grabbed a fallen piece of conduit, a heavy length of metal pipe, and moved to Nari's side. He didn't have her training or her grace, but he had a mechanic's strength and a desperate need to protect her. They stood back to back, a makeshift fortress of two. He swung the pipe at an attacker trying to rush through the breached door, connecting with a sickening crunch. Nari fired twice, two controlled shots that dropped another operative. Human and Valkyrie pressed together, protecting the one truth that could save both their peoples. The neural link port in her temple, the socket where the device had been Jico, began to bleed from the strain and adrenaline, a trickle of blue tracing a path down her cheek. She ignored it completely, her focus absolute, her movements economical and deadly. Holt took a shot to the shoulder, the impact spinning him around. He grunted, slamming against the wall but staying on his feet. He clamped a hand over the wound, blood welling between his fingers. "Howell, status," he yelled, his voice ragged with pain but still commanding. "Jeremy, left flank. They're bringing a ram in." He kept shouting orders, directing their desperate defense even as his own blood pooled on the floor. His authority held them together, a focal point in the chaos. They became a single organism in that smoke-filled, chaotic room, a bleeding, defiant entity fighting for its life. Jeremy with his crude metal pipe, Nari with her precise marksmanship, Howell with her unbreakable data stream, and Holt with his bleeding shoulder and unwavering commands. They were outnumbered, cornered, and hurting, but they were united. Each breath, each movement was coordinated not by discussion, but by a shared, desperate goal: survive long enough for the truth to finish its work. The sound of the plasma cutter started again, this time on the interior wall. They were coming from another direction. The organism adjusted, turning to face the new threat, a collective will to live overriding individual pain. In the medbay's stark light, the air hummed with the low, frantic beeping of monitors and the sharp scent of sterilizer. Dr. Sims worked with a focused intensity, delivering the child while Specialist Taryn stabilized Nari, her four-fingered hands moving with precision over bioscanners and medical injectors. The baby emerged, a small, still form with pale blue skin and a shock of silver-brown hair. For a second, there was only silence. Then the monitors screamed. The infant wasn't breathing. Its tiny chest remained still. Human lungs, designed for a nitrogen-oxygen mix, struggled to process the slightly different Valkyrie atmosphere, the delicate alveoli refusing to inflate properly. The child's skin began to tinge a worrying gray. Jeremy didn't think. He pushed past the medics. His large mechanic's hands, usually coated in grease and capable of calibrating engine tolerances to the micron, now looked impossibly clumsy. He placed them on the tiny chest, his fingers finding the fragile sternum. He began compressions, a rhythm he'd learned in a basic station safety course a lifetime ago. The contrast was heartbreaking. The brute strength of a man who repaired heavy machinery applied with terrified gentleness to his own child. Each compression was a prayer, a desperate hope against biological impossibility. He leaned down, sealed his mouth over the baby's nose and mouth, and breathed for it, forcing his own human oxygenated air into lungs that didn't want it. The infant gasped. The sound was a wet, ragged intake that seemed to tear through the tense silence of the medbay. Then it cried. The sound that followed was unlike anything any of them had ever heard. It wasn't a purely human wail or a Valkyrie warble. It was both, layered over each other. Two distinct vocal tones harmonizing in a single cry, a biological paradox given voice. It was the sound of a new future, raw and undeniable. 3 months later, the transformation that united the species was living in a small apartment near the Cultural Exchange Center. Nari's tongue, regrown through daily applications of the prototype biogel, had healed. The process had been agonizingly slow, each millimeter of new tissue a victory paid for in pain. She looked at Jeremy, her bioluminescent markings soft in the ambient light. Her lips parted. Her new tongue, her own flesh and blood, formed its first word. Jeremy. Her voice was her own. It wasn't the mechanical drone of the synthesizer or the strained hum of the temporary implant. It was a voice that held the musical cadence of her people, but the warmth of their shared experience. It was uniquely wholly Nari. Their child, Tar, cooed in his crib. His eyes, wide and alert, held the star-patterned iris common to Valkyrie, a constellation of light in a sea of deep blue. But the resilience in his gaze, the stubborn set of his jaw when he was hungry, that was all human. A reflection of the DNA that had refused to let his lungs quit. He was a living contradiction to every biology text, a miracle written in flesh and blood. High Elder Marina arrived without ceremony, her presence a quiet acknowledgement of the shift in power. She was an older Valkyrie woman, her cranial ridges etched with the patterns of long service. She didn't look at the child as a specimen or an anomaly. She looked at him as a person. Then she bowed. a deep formal gesture of respect directed not at her but at their small family unit. "This child rewrites our biology texts," she said, her voice filled with a wonder that transcended politics. It was a simple statement of fact, devoid of ceremony, that carried the weight of an epoch. Dravik watched the public news feeds from his rehabilitation cell, the image of the healthy hybrid child playing on a loop. His genocide plot was now a lesson plan, a case study in the consequences of hatred, used to teach a new generation about the cost of division. The man who had planned the quiet death of thousands now lived with the loud, living proof of his failure. The contaminated shipping routes, the same corridors Jeremy had once serviced and Nari had exposed, were not simply shut down. They were repurposed. They became joint inspection corridors, manned by mixed teams of human and Valkyrie technicians. Every shipment, every crate, now passed under the scrutiny of both species, a permanent guard against the poison of secrecy. The infrastructure of betrayal had become the architecture of trust, a daily working reminder that vigilance was the price of their hard-won peace. The hum of the stations along those routes was no longer the sound of commerce or conspiracy, but the sound of cooperation, a low, constant promise that they woo. 3 months later, the Human Valkyrie Cultural Exchange Center held a silence so deep, you could hear the hum of the life support systems. Nari stood at the podium, the lights catching the subtle bioluminescent patterns on her skin. She looked out over the gathered crowd, a sea of human and Valkyrie faces. Some faces held hard, quiet hatred, eyes narrowed with generations of distrust and the fresh wounds of Dravik's conspiracy. Others watched her with a raw, desperate hope, their expressions pleading for the fragile peace to hold. The tension was a physical weight in the recycled air. She leaned toward the microphone. No silver implant glittered at her throat. No neural link port was visible at her temple. Her lips parted. The voice that emerged was entirely her own. "We cannot change the past." The words were clear, resonant, and utterly organic. There was no static, no mechanical filtering. Her cadence was a unique blend, carrying the soft musical rise and fall of Valkyrie speech patterns but anchored by the direct, declarative strength of human language. It was a voice forged in loss and rebuilt through a miracle of cross-species science. The medical solution had been born from the very conflict that sought to tear them apart. Valkyrie biotechnology, specifically the prototype biogel suppressed by Dravik's regime, had achieved what human medicine could not. Its cellular regeneration properties worked at an accelerated rate, far faster than any standard human treatment. The biogel, applied daily, stimulated nerve endings and tissue growth with a precision that minimized scarring and maximized functional recovery. The process was agonizing, a constant, grueling pain that Nari had endured without complaint, focused on the single goal of speaking her own truth with her own voice. It was a mercy Dravik had deemed a weakness, a compassion his ideology could not tolerate, and it had become the key to her restoration. In the front row, Jeremy held their son. Tar cooed softly, a living bridge cradled in his father's arms. The infant's star-patterned Valkyrie eyes were wide, taking in the lights and the murmuring crowd. He was the impossible proof that their species could create something new together, a biological argument against separation that was stronger than any political rhetoric. Jeremy's thumb gently stroked the baby's cheek, his focus split between his son and the woman at the podium. His own journey from a neutral mechanic to a central figure in this new alliance was written in the protective curve of his shoulders. Nari's gaze swept across the audience, meeting the hostile stares and the hopeful ones with the same steady resolve. "We build a future where truth is valued above politics." She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The simple statement, delivered in her own recovered voice, cut through the room's tension. It was a promise and a challenge, a line drawn in the sand. It acknowledged the pain on both sides without being defined by it, pointing toward a shared purpose that was more powerful than old hatreds. The crowd erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a cross-species roar of approval, a sound never before heard on Helio Station. Human hands clapped alongside the softer four-fingered percussion of Valkyrie palms meeting. It was a messy, dissonant, and beautiful cacophony of unity. The sound washed over the stage, a wave of acceptance and shared purpose that made the light seem brighter, the air easier to breathe. The desperate hope in many eyes began to solidify into something stronger, something like belief. Jeremy moved toward the stage, tar held securely against his chest. He stepped up beside Nari, his eyes never leaving her face. He saw the strength it had taken to stand there, the memory of pain in the set of her jaw and the fierce hope in her eyes. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a dramatic theatrical gesture for the crowd. It was quiet, intimate, and specific. His lips met hers and he tasted no metallic residue from a device, no artificial coolness from a biogel application. He tasted only her, and the profound, hard-won forgiveness that flowed between them. It was a private moment in a public space, a seal on the future they had chosen to build. The cheering around them continued, but for that second, they existed in a bubble of their own making, bound by loss, salvation, and a child who was both. Back in his workshop, the familiar scent of ozone and machine grease was a welcome anchor. Jeremy bent over the open casing of a Valkyrie transport engine, his hands moving with the same surety they'd always had. The components were different, alien alloys and energy conduits that hummed at a slightly higher frequency than their human counterparts. But the underlying principles of power, connection, and repair remained the same. It was a language he still understood perfectly. Nari stood beside him, her presence a quiet constant. She handed him a calibrated tension wrench, her four-fingered hand brushing against his. The contact was brief, deliberate, a familiar rhythm they'd built together in the months since the tribunal. Her skin was still cooler than his, a fact that no longer felt alien, just uniquely hers. The scars remained. They were there in the faint, almost silvery line that traced the curve of her lips, the only visible mark left by the biogel's meticulous work. They were there in the tense silences that still sometimes fell over station council meetings, in the wary glances exchanged in corridors where trust was still a new and fragile construct. And they were there in the hollow look that occasionally flickered behind Jeremy's eyes when a sudden noise echoed too sharply in a confined space, a ghost of the fear that had lived in his gut for weeks. The past was a part of the station's superstructure now, a layer of history welded permanently beneath the new plating. On a high shelf, cleaned of grease and blood, the neural link device sat under a clear casing. A small laser-engraved plaque on the base was labeled simply, Instrument of Truth. It was museum-bound, scheduled for display in the central concourse as a relic of their brutal recent history. It looked harmless now, a piece of outdated tech. It was impossible to reconcile its inert form with the seismic role it had played, the terrible hum it had emitted in his workshop, the static, the first synthesized words that had unraveled a genocide. It was a monument to a terrible cost and a necessary gamble. He laid the wrench down on the bench, the metal clicking softly against the surface. He looked at Nari, really looked at her, taking in the calm intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her posture. The question that had haunted the station, that journalists and historians had asked him a dozen times, finally found its answer in the quiet of his own workshop, away from microphones and expectant stares. Because some truths are worth more than a life, he said. The words were quiet, not a grand pronouncement, but a simple statement of fact. It was the only math that made sense. His life, any single life, was a small price for exposing a truth that would save thousands, that would forge a new future from the wreckage of the old. It was the fundamental calculation he'd made in the market square, and he would make it again. Nari smiled, a true, unforced expression that softened the line of her scar. Her new tongue, her own flesh and blood, formed the words with perfect practiced clarity. And some mercies build new worlds. Her voice was her own, a blend of Valkyrie melody and the resilience they had earned together. Her statement was the other side of his equation. His act of mercy, pulling a bleeding enemy from a public execution, hadn't just saved a life. It had been the first brick laid in a new foundation. That single choice had set everything in motion, proving that compassion could be a more powerful engine for change than any weapon or political decree. On a padded mat nearby, their son Tar reached for a glowing power wrench from a discarded toolkit, the soft blue light from its status indicator reflected in his eyes that held the star-patterned iris of his mother's people, but a depth and curiosity that was entirely his own. His small hybrid fingers closed around the tool's handle, not with the clumsiness of a baby, but with a focused intent. He seemed to study the light, his gaze seeming to see past the mere object to the energy flowing within it, understanding things in a way no purebred human or Valkyrie ever could. Outside the workshop's open doorway, the sound of children playing echoed down the corridor, the sharp, bright laughter of human kids mixed with the softer, warbling calls of Valkyrie young. Their game involved a bouncing light sphere that changed color when kicked, a simple toy that required cooperation. They ran through corridors that had once been stained with blood and echoed with the bootsteps of enforcers. Now the scuffs on the walls were from sneakers and soft-soled boots. The shouts were from play, not pain. The station hummed around them, a deep, constant vibration that resonated through the deck plates and into the bones. It was the same sound it had always made, the sound of life support and gravity control and massive engines holding a bubble of atmosphere in the void. But the character of the hum had changed. It was no longer the background noise of silent fear and suppressed tension, the latent threat of weapon systems cycling or security patrols moving to a crisis. This was a different frequency altogether. It was the sound of systems operating at peaceful capacity, of energy being used for light and warmth and growth. It was the sound of an impossible, hard-won peace maintained not by force but by the daily, deliberate choice to value truth and mercy above all else. Her tongue was severed for speaking lies, but her truth reshaped two civilizations. A mechanic's single act of defiance, pulling a bleeding stranger from a public square, rewrote the future for everyone. It exposed a genocide, challenged prejudice, and forged a bond stronger than politics or biology. This is the profound impact one person's courage can have. As their child now plays in corridors once stained with blood, remember, some truths are worth any risk. So consider this. What truth would you risk everything to reveal, and who might be waiting to stand with you when you do?